afternoon, and welcome to our webinar on how to advocate for state and local funding to support refugee and immigrant communities. Thank you to everyone who is able to join us today. My name is Belkis Mehrig, and I'm the Senior Policy Counsel at the International Refugee Assistance Project and Policy Advisor to the Refugee Advocacy Lab. The Refugee Advocacy Lab is an initiative hosted at Refugees International and co-founded with IRAP, the International Rescue Committee, and Refugee Congress. Our mission is to grow the diverse constituency of U.S. leadership on refugee protection. We do so by building partnerships, supporting inclusive policies, and developing thought products for the common good, such as the report on utilizing American Rescue Plan funding, or ARPA for short, which we produced alongside this webinar as a resource for those of you advocating for funding at the state and local level. Many states and localities are just starting the process of allocating the $350 billion in American Rescue Plan state and local funding. 2022 presents an important opportunity for advocates to mobilize and ensure that refugee and immigrant communities, many who bore the disproportionate brunt of the pandemic, receive the support they need. Unlike its predecessor, the CARES Act, ARPA is far more expansive in terms of the type of services that can be covered, and more importantly, it explicitly prioritizes underserved and underprivileged communities of color. We truly hope our report is of benefit to advocates, service providers, and lawmakers alike, and the lab is here to answer questions and support your work. You can reach us at info@refugeeadvocacylab.org. Today, we're joined by a remarkable group of guest speakers who we're really honored to have with us today. Please join me in welcoming Senator Casey Jama, Britt Conroy, and Neera Sumik. Senator Jama represents District 24 in Salem, Oregon, and is a former refugee from Somalia who came to the United States in 1998. He is the first former refugee and the first Muslim serving in the Oregon Senate. He was previously the co-founder and executive director of Unite Oregon, where among his many responsibilities, he trained immigrant and refugee leaders all over the country. He lives with his wife and children in East Portland. Britt Conroy serves as the Director of Public Policy and Environmental Advocacy for Economical Ministries of Oregon, where he leads the organization's advocacy efforts to make Oregon a more welcoming state to immigrants and refugees, provide housing for the unhoused, address climate change, and strengthen anti-poverty programs, among other areas of focus. He's married and is the father of 2 wonderful children and lives in East Portland. Portland. Neera Sumik is a former refugee who was forced to flee from her home country of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Being a former refugee has not only instilled in her a sense of purpose, but also fueled her determination to work as a human rights advocate. In her current role, she's the National Field Manager for We Are All America campaign, where she helps organize and advocate for refugees and asylum seekers. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Before we begin, a reminder to our audience that if you have a question for any of our speakers, please pop it into the chat. We have about 10 to 15 minutes reserved at the end for Q&A. So, Senator Jama, I'm going to begin with you. You championed SB 5561, which was a legislative funding package that secured $18 million in 2021, the largest investment in the country for housing, legal, and other support for Afghan evacuees. Can you tell us more about how this effort came to be?
Thank you, Belkis, and good afternoon, everyone. I think to start your question, definitely we all remember and saw the heartbreaking images of Kabul, what happened, and when the U.S. Army military withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the issues of refugees and immigrants is issues that's really dear to me, because as a former refugee, I understand what's like to be in that space. So when those images and those issues came emerge, we're horrified, but particularly for me was almost, having some sort of a PTSD situation. So I ended up actually calling my colleague, Representative Khan Pham, who is also, her parents also refugees from Vietnam war. So both of us just talked about this issue and how we share strategies and, just checking with each other. And we really immediately said, we can't understand, we have to do something about it. So with that said, but also reminding both of us came from an organizing background. We collaborated when both of us work in nonprofit world, so we understand the role of leadership, playing a leadership role, but also understanding the concept of people. When impacted people take leadership role, we can see different results. So that's really how we started, and really immediately contacted our governor's office and wrote a letter to the governor and the other legislators asking them to Oregon to become a welcoming state. And to the matter of days, we were able to get that letter signed by the governor, but also co-signed by both majority of our House and Senate representative and the senators. So we have those folks, majority of all of them, both Republican and Democrats, signing up, co-signing the letter. So that was our first initial stage, and really helping us to guide the conversation about, because we were got contact information from community members who are all saying that, how can we help? How can we participate also as well? So it was a galvanizing moment for all our community to come together and really making Oregon to be a welcoming state. And that was the process, how we started. But of course, we have our resettlement agencies who are also have a long history of working and supporting refugee populations in our Oregon. So in collaboration of the resettlement agencies, that was our second contact folks that we immediately contacted and said, how can we work together? Based on those conversations, we have our resettlement agencies and our community overall. We came together and created a task force or work group that really kind of became a hub where we decided to strategize and push the issues forward. And that's really how we were able to take this issue to the heart of the Oregonians.
Thank you. And as part of that task force, was the bill born of that?
No, I think that definitely yes, but partially it was larger context stuff around. First of all, as you know, refugee resettlement agencies was gutted in their work that they have been doing prior to the prior administrations because of the lack of capacity and we had a conversation about, provided that we are in situations where we have an opportunity to really change the narrative of overall. How do we ensure that those refugees who are arriving get the support that they need, but ensuring that also our resettlement agencies rebuilding their infrastructure? That's context of the conversations that we have, and the bill that we just passed, became larger discussions around how do we support our immigrant refugee populations. So that's really overall the work that we have done. But more importantly, really, the key element of this is about community engagement and really having the table, we set the table to ensure that our resettlement agencies and our partners are at the table to having that conversation, exchange ideas, and also organizing together collectively.
Thank you. And Britt, I'm going to turn it to you now, since you were involved in the same effort. Can you share us on how you can share with us how you came to be involved and the advocacy that led to this successful outcome?
Yeah, good afternoon, Bucky. Thanks for having me, and it's always a privilege and honor to be in Indian conversation with Senator Jama. As organizations that have resettled refugees for decades, you can imagine what a gift it is to have someone like Senator Jama or Representative Pham in the legislature who is dedicated to the work and dedicated to community solutions to support refugees and immigrants. So as an advocate, I have to say that there's nothing more impactful than to get a call from someone like Senator Jama, which we did right after the fall of Kabul, saying, how can we help? How can we bring together organizations across the state, both refugee settlement agencies and others, to problem solve about how we can resettle and do our part to resettle as many Afghan evacuees as possible, and provide them with the support they need to truly thrive to maybe go above and beyond what traditionally takes place in this country when it comes to supporting refugees and others. And that invitation really spurred our organizations to reach out to our own partners across the state and convene a group of folks to think about what is needed and how can we contribute to this larger structure that Senator Jama Merchant of Fam created. What is it that, what are we hearing from the community, from our clients, from those who are anxiously awaiting the arrival of family members from Afghanistan, that we can bring forward and say, these are the needs that we've identified, add them to your list, and let's move forward together. I think it has to be, I can't underscore enough how important it is that Senator Jama and Representative Pham took the initiative in drafting this letter and in really creating a bipartisan, community-focused frame for this larger conversation. Everyone felt included. Everyone felt like their values were represented, regardless of party, and everyone felt like they were listened to in terms of their expertise, whether it was on the ground or as service providers or others. And so I think that what Senator Jama and Representative Pham created really paved a path for success moving forward.
Thank you, Britt. Lately it's been hard to hear, bipartisan approaches to refugee issues. And I'm going to tease this out later on in our webinar, but it's really great to see efforts on both sides of the aisle to welcome Afghan evacuees. Naira, I'm going to turn it to you now. The Arizona Coalition of We're All America successfully advocated for a $3 million allocation for housing and utility assistance. Can you tell us more about the coalition or how the coalition went about securing this grant from the Phoenix City Council?
Yeah, thanks, Balkis. So yeah, in 2020, we were able to secure $3 million from the CARES Act funding that directly went to rent and housing and utility assistance for refugees and immigrants here in the city of Phoenix in Arizona. And we really did this through advocacy, collective work, and as Senator Jama was mentioning earlier, community support. And we really pushed our elected officials and champions to provide immediate needs and resources to this very vulnerable population. We worked really hard to establish relationships with the city council. We took a lot of time to educate them on the needs on this population. And really that is the key oftentimes, is really educating our elected officials. And we started to build a sense of infrastructure within the city to have representation of refugees within different city departments and entities. We met with different departments such as the neighborhood housing services, for example, their housing director. We met with every city council. And we wanted to make sure that refugees and immigrants were included part of this package. Another example we worked on is housing vouchers, and in having the city create an MOU, a special MOU that would allow refugees here to access the vouchers and for it to be more accessible. We also ensured when we were advocating for the funding that we weren't just including resettlement agencies, but also our ethnic community-based organizations, because many of them are working directly with local communities. And we wanted to ensure that they also had access to this funding and that the city knew about these organizations and how to work with these organizations. We worked really hard with the city to modify some of their process to ensure that there isn't this red tape or, part of this bigger bureaucracy that would prevent RAs and ethnic community-based organizations from accessing this fund. Finally, what we did at the end, once we secured the funding, once it went out to the community, what we did was we brought back the city together and the different entities, and we gave them feedback in a really constructive way. But we realized and recognized there were some things that worked and some things that really didn't work with this population. And so we gave them feedback. And then the last thing I'll mention, and this, for some of you who live in red states and are wanting to do this kind of work, sometimes legal action is something that needs to happen. That way, all refugee and immigrants are included in accessing resources and funding. So here in Arizona, there was actually a lawsuit against the city in order to ensure that refugees and immigrants had an opportunity to the federal CARE Act funding, and we won the lawsuit. So back to you, Belkis.
That's really incredible. We did hear a lot about, residency requirements that would disentitle recently resettled refugees who, are a group identified by the CDC as particularly vulnerable and who should be receiving these COVID relief funds, but they were left out. And so that's really great to hear that that action was successful. Senator Jam, I'm going to turn it back to you. When we hear the number 18 million, a lot of us are like, wow, how did they manage to do that? Was it difficult convincing your colleagues to allocate that amount, and how were you able to successfully achieve that?
Thank you, Bilqis, again. That's really important question. I think for me, $18 million was even enough. Just because I know the need of our resettlement agencies and our need of our community. So with that said, I think some of the challenges that we faced, of course, has been timing, because we were in the middle of, we almost just finished in our meeting, our session in July. So we were not in a session when the refugee crisis arrived. So figuring out how do we act quickly and get the emergency funding available to our resettlement agencies was a challenging issue for us. I think in terms of the overcoming and pushing $18 million, as I said earlier, this is really our approach has been always bipartisan support for the immigrant refugees. So we both proactively, both Representative Pham and I, outreach both Republican and Democrat colleagues, ensuring that this is not an issue that should be a partisan issue. It really, we need to come together as a community to address this issue. So with that said, I think really $18 million, again, as I said, it was not enough, but at the end of the day, our goal is that how do we identify the need and work with our resettlement agencies, as refugees were arriving, we were struggling with how many numbers will come to Oregon, and identifying those needs of those refugees has been one of the biggest challenges. So we're trying to match the resources and the needs together collectively. So if we're receiving, over 1,000 refugees from Afghanistan, how do we ensure that the resource we're providing is actually significantly in terms of housing, education, healthcare, all of those agencies that will provide those services has to be at the table and engage conversations about what do you need in order to ensure the support for immigrant refugee population. And the other piece that I want to highlight is that housing was the biggest challenge that we faced, because Oregon, as many other states in the country, were short supplies on housing. So ensuring those refugees when they arrive, how do we house them? So in order to do that, we work collaboratively with our state agencies, providing shelters and making sure that those shelters are also allocated for resources. So we really have to we have to really add it together, resources, say that housing, we need this much, in terms of, healthcare, we need this much, interpreting, we need this much, culturally appropriate services, food, we need this much. So it was really more of around the process of engagement work group that we created, and identifying resources that way, and working with our resettlement agencies closely to ensure that they have what they need to support the refugees. So that's how we came up with the $18 million. But I think definitely, I don't think so it's finished yet. I think our goal is to push more forward as we come to the next session for 2022 and beyond as well. So we're not done yet.
Great to hear. I want to follow up on that question. Do you have any, advice or recommendations on navigating the state budget process? I know you were in a special session when you passed SB 5561, but for those in our audience who've never, advocated or navigated state budget processes, what advice do you have for them? What recommendations? How should they, start the process of that kind of advocacy?
Thank you. I think it's an important question. I think the first step I'm going to say is that relationships. I think, the work starts when you have relationship with people. It's much easier to approach that. So my suggestion is that, I know it's cliche, but at the beginning, when you really start your advocacy, you have to make sure that you build relationships, both folks who are in the buildings, both House and the Senate side of your work, and ensuring that you have that kind of a one-on-one relationships and building those relationships, advocacy relationships as well. So that's one thing, relationships. The second piece is that I'm going to highlight is that I think understanding how the budget system works and who are the decision makers in your state, who can ensure that the resources allocated for refugees and immigrants will be key. So understanding the system itself and process that people go through it, who is your Ways and Means Committee chairs, who is your, folks who are actually making those decisions, budget state agencies as well. So really making sure that you really do your homework and understand how the decision-making process works, and ensuring that then you create a space where all our immigrant refugee community members can participate in the advocacy of the work. So really both the community organizing aspect of it and then building relationships and then understanding the system. Those are three components that I will highly encourage people to look into it.
Thank you, Senator Jama. That's a super helpful answer. Britt, I want to turn it to you from a perspective of an advocate. Do you have anything to add on navigating state budget processes?
Yeah, I think so often state budget processes are so opaque and confusing for outside service providers and even advocates. And that's why it's so crucial to have those relationships, like Senator Jama says. If you're able to come in to have a conversation with a legislator or their staff, outline the challenges you see in their community, and bring along with you an impacted community member to really in their own voice share what those challenges or aspirations might be. You could, after a few meetings, my guess is you're going to find partners in your work. You're going to find someone who is willing to champion your issue, or at the very least willing to give you some guidance on how to understand these processes. So that chief of staff, the legislative assistant, that member of the legislature will help point you in the right direction and walk you through where you need to go next. I think here in Oregon, nothing gets done unless we have strong coalitions. And so often, what, as an advocate, the most important thing that we can do is get fellow advocates in a room and talk about who has what relationships and how to move forward. Get even just a practical level of having weekly meetings and make it a priority within the organizations to move these things forward. That there's a lot of knowledge there to understand both budget processes and to leverage relationships and leverage understanding of community need to move forward. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to accomplish great things with this work, especially, the other thing I would just add is, especially if we're willing to start small. Senator Jama hasn't mentioned it yet, but he was crucial in securing $2 million 2 years ago for recently arrived refugees. As he mentioned, under the previous administration, there had been key services that had been cut, and Senator Jama and a larger coalition were responsible for getting that initial $2 million investment in support services. And that created a wealth of positive relationships of people who saw themselves as bipartisan defenders of refugees and immigrants, and I think that laid a really strong foundation for this much larger ask this last few months.
Thanks, Britt. That's really insightful. I want to turn to the question of coalitions, and I'm going to ask you this question, and Neera as well. Can you tell us more about the coalition of groups you worked with and how you were able to collaborate effectively? Were there any tactics or strategies that you found particularly effective?
Yeah, first of all, I think having folks, number one, from lived experience and personal experience, part of your advocacy work and building relationships and partnerships. You really want folks who were impacted, like former refugees. And as Britt mentioned, and Senator Jama, like building relationships is really key, and I cannot re-emphasize that because it's so important. Also, collective work and alignment with your partners. So I really started out with one-on-one meetings, building those relationships, and getting to know folks and what their priorities are, what their needs are, what matters, and what is important to them. And we also brought together a wide range of different sectors. So when I started building out here in Arizona, the We Are All America Arizona Coalition, we really wanted to make sure that it was represented of different diverse sectors. So we had people from the faith community, we had resettlement agencies, we had government entities and elected officials on the coalition, we had nonprofits on there. So it was a very diverse group of folks who sit on the coalition. And we really focused on policy, advocacy, and grassroots work. So I would recommend for folks out there that if you're trying to build partnerships, that if you work out of a strong coalition, if you have that in your locality. If you don't, then start out with establishing a small team of your own, a small planning committee or a small team of folks who really believe in your initiative and are willing to do the hard work with you. So that's the key. You really need to find folks who are willing to do the work with you. Also bringing in new innovative partners, which you may have not worked with in the past, but they may have experience in whatever your initiative is. So think outside the box and not just the same folks who come around every time, but how can you bring in new innovative partners to expand those relationships and expand your resources? Also, when it comes to allies and champions, in our case, it was the city council vice mayor's office who was really our champion. But your champions should be someone who is a high profile individual, people of power and has a good reputation in the community. It could be an elected official, but it doesn't need to be, but really someone who supports and is passionate about your work and about refugees and is willing to be a champion and stand up and speak up on your behalf. Also, I think it's important to do research on what the current needs of the community are. And make sure that you're prioritizing and addressing those and not necessarily just have your agenda, but really that you're understand the needs of the community and you're kind of meeting them halfway to make sure that you're representing that.
As a follow-up, Nayra, and I'm going to turn it back to you, Britt and Senator Jama, in a minute, but were there any challenges that were specific to advocacy at the local level? How is that different from advocating at the state level? Is it easier? Is it, as we know, American Rescue Plan funding is being allocated both at the state and local level, and in Arizona specifically, because the state hasn't been successful in allocating funding, a lot of that funding is being distributed at the local level. So can you tell us more, about advocacy at the local level and how you navigate, the local municipal budget process, for example?
Yeah, I would say that it's important to be engaged. It's important to be involved in the city council, your localities, be at the public meetings, understand what your city's priorities are. Because if you're not engaged, if you're not connected, then it's going to be really difficult for you to push anything in your city as far as policy. So I would recommend being engaged in really those public city meetings, and most of them are online, so you can even watch them, from your house on your computer. You don't necessarily have to go in person. And make sure that you understand also like funds like the ARPA funds or the CARES Act funds that came, 2 years ago, to ensure that you understand how that distribution works, what the city's priorities are in the next 2 years, and also other cities, what are they working on? And at the county level, how can you also work with counties? And like in our case, for example, we're working with both the city and the county for a housing project here in Arizona. So I would just say, make sure that you're engaged and that you understand where your city's priorities are.
That's a really good point about counties, because they're also getting their own allocations in addition to metropolitan cities and the state. Britt and Senator Jama, I wanted to, ask you a little more about how you worked within coalitions and what was effective in Oregon in terms of strategies, and how these coalitions, who was involved, how did you work together, and how did you make this happen? And Senator Jama, I'll hand it to you to answer first.
Thank you, Balqis. Again, I'm going to start what I said earlier, which is really around, engaging people who are impacted. The issue has to be key center of our work. So as former refugee, as a former executive director of Unite Oregon, I already had established relationships with many number of coalitions, including our settlement agencies. I actually used to work with Lutheran Community Service Northwest, so I actually was familiar with the settlement programs and the agencies as well. So for us, and Representative Vam actually also used to work another nonprofit agencies in our community. So both of us had a very deep-rooted connections to our immigrant refugee populations, but overall larger coalitions that we built it together. So what we did as a work group, that we of course sit down immediately collectively and said, okay, who needs to be at the table? So we engaged the settlement agencies. We engaged then immigrant refugee organizations who are representing those communities. We engaged Afghan community organizations who are new, and also we brought them to the table, because we have to ensure that people who are impacted, the issue has to be at the table. Then we of course engaged our agencies, state agencies, which is housing, if we want to talk about housing, which state agencies do we need to involve? Education, healthcare, as I said earlier, all of these agencies we identified and we brought them together collectively at the table. And then of course, on top of that, we constantly engage our elected officials, both in the House and the Senate, to keep them informed what we are doing and how we are proceeding. So although we came together very quickly, we actually were able to bring a larger groups of organizations and community leaders come together addressing this issue. So really, it was collectively ensuring that we make sure everyone who needs to be at the table is at the table, actually, and that's how we did it overall.
Thank you. And Britt, do you have anything?
Yeah, I as advocates, we tried to launch a parallel effort where, as Kabul fell, we created a community conversation where we tried to invite not just settlement agencies, but representatives of local Afghan community, representatives of other culturally-based organizations, community groups that had a long history in community organizing, including Senator Jama's former organization, to try to just have a listening session about what's an initial list of needs that we're hearing from the community. What do we expect the needs to be as Afghan evacuees arrive? And then from that we kind of kept that group going while breaking into small groups and developing mini budget proposals for Senator Jama and others around different areas. So try to say, what does a housing package look like? What does a legal needs package look like? Mental health care, culture-specific food, so that we could leverage our resources and bring to elected officials, like I said, a set of mini budgets that they could then consider as they took advice from other folks. One of the biggest challenges when it comes to this particular crisis is that right from the beginning, we didn't know how many Afghan evacuees would arrive, what level of federal support they would receive, and those are just real basic things that prevented us from doing an initial calculation of what our request should be. And so we eventually just settled on an approach of, for every 300 Afghan evacuees, what is it that we would like the state to invest? And then we try to just take that in a menu form to legislators, and just who are our champions and have the political insights about what is possible in the state budget. And Senator John and Representative were able to take that as one of many pieces of information from agencies, from other community partners, and it felt incredibly rewarding, kind of just do our part to keep them informed. And I think just on the practical level, so many of us are doing the work and don't have time to be advocates as well, right? And so that being really intentional about sharing that advocacy load and identifying a coordinator, setting weekly meetings so that after a few weeks it becomes habitual, kind of normal to get on those calls and get updates, breaking apart the work, and trying to find whether it's a legislator's staffer or whether it's another advocate with experience, someone who can come and guide the work is just incredibly helpful. And I think that it's again, without the coalition, very few of these things can be accomplished. So it's again trying to just recognize that all of us have, it sounds a little cliche, but within the groups that we brought together, some had deep experience providing housing, some had deep experience providing legal services, and we were able to leverage those insights and that knowledge to bring forward ideas and keep legislators informed.
Thank you so much for those insights on how to work within a coalition. I hope our audience find them super helpful. I want to now turn it to 2022 as we're in the beginning of the year, and to talk a little bit about where we go from here and your visions. Senator Jama, you touched on this several times earlier, and we've enjoyed some rare bipartisan support for Afghan evacuees that we haven't seen in some time. Do you have any suggestions on how we can increase support from both sides of the aisle for refugees more broadly?
Thank you, Balqis. And again, I recognize that every state is different and every municipality is different in terms of who you're dealing with and how you're approaching the issue. So I understand that there might not be a strategy that can blankly you can apply to all across the state. So I really encourage you that you come up with your own local strategy and state strategy that helps you. But in terms of what worked for us in Oregon, in terms of that, we really try to get into the value conversations, right? So it wasn't about, of course, it was about the crisis of the Afghan refugees, but in terms of our conversation hasn't started as a task completion. It was more about what kind of Oregon do we want to live? How do we make sure that Oregon becomes a welcoming state? And we engaged that conversation, both the Republican and Democrat colleagues both in the House and the Senate, to build that values of that we all care about welcoming Oregon to becoming a welcoming state. And so we are engaged more about narrative and value-based, understanding that, of course, not everybody agree with us. Not everybody, we know that there's sentiment of, xenophobic. So I don't want to, put a rosy picture that, everything is great. Of course, we also have that elements of anti-immigrant, anti-xenophobic folks who are really pushing their own narrative. But I think overall, I would consider what we were able to do is because of the deep relationships that we have with the community, but also the value-based conversation that we engage in the community. So it wasn't about trying to divide the community, but more about bringing collectively together. So creating that kind of a vision of it wasn't, as I said earlier, it wasn't about the activity. It was about what's the vision of Oregon and how do we make sure that immigrant and refugee community members are part of that vision. And so it was more about that value conversations that we were able to have that help us to get where we need to be.
Thank you. And totally hear you about, not every state is the same. Britt and Neera, I want to turn it over to you. Where do you go from here after, for Britt, such a successful 2021? What's your strategy for 2022 and what are your hopes?
I may just first add to what Senator John was saying there. I think it's really important. I think he and his fellow legislators have done a great job of creating a narrative about what kind of Oregon we want. I think the other part of the conversation is having conversations about who are full members of our Oregon community. I think one of the reasons we've been so successful collectively in Oregon is that regardless of your politics or what's happening in Washington, D.C., there are Oregonians in need, and we have a responsibility to do our share and take care of each other. I also think that in this work, it's so important to identify the trusted messenger of a particular legislator. Some legislators responded really, really well to conversations with Afghan and Iraqi war veterans, for example. One of the most powerful meetings I've ever been a part of in all my years doing this work was a few months ago, sitting virtually in a meeting with a former interpreter from Afghanistan who was lobbying a state senator whose chief of staff served with U.S. Armed Forces in the region. And the connection, even virtually in that moment, of former interpreter and former soldier was so powerful that these are the kind of connections I could, I certainly could never offer. And trying to find those connections is so key. I think when we look at 2022, I think so much of our wonderful success as a state has been limited to budget investments, and they've been massive. But the question I think always is, how are we changing the conversation about who belongs, and how do we get to policies, long-term policy change? I can say that one of the things that we're looking at is a change to the level of support that refugees receive when they arrive in the United States. We know that that refugee cash assistance in about the year 2000 for an individual person was worth about $232 per month. Now, about 20 years later, it's worth $239 per month. We've just increased that support to $7 a month. These are policy changes at the federal level that can be supplemented at the state level to really make changes in the lives of individuals. I think we're also trying to help. The next stage really is, now that we have such goodwill around supporting Afghans because of our role in Afghanistan and the challenges these communities face, how do we help legislators, elected officials see that those challenges are not that different from those who need legal representation, not that different from those who are asylum seekers, not that different from refugees from other communities, and get to a spot where we're robustly funding and providing opportunities for all of our communities. And then finally, I think continuing to drag this issue of immigrant rights and particularly refugee concerns out of our partisan political battlefields. As I understand it, the president that welcomed the most refugees was Ronald Reagan. Here in Oregon, our top advocate for refugees over the last few decades was a man named Senator Mark Hatfield, who was Republican. These are issues that have long been bipartisan, and as Senator Jama has been able to do, pull them back into the bipartisan spheres is going to make everything else possible.
Okay, can I jump quickly, just add quickly? I think Preet really hit great points that are still important to be highlighted. I think one of the challenges that we are facing is that sometimes, and I want to be very careful how I frame this conversation because it's an important one, that we don't want to have to play into the situation where we are bidding one community against another one. So we are bidding immigrants against refugees. I think really we have to make sure that we have to talk about values, about ensuring that, as Preeti was saying that earlier, all Oregonians, all our community members are being served. So I think, sometimes we have those challenges that we have to ensuring that we don't have to choose one community from another, but we are equally advocating for all communities. And I think also, just as I was saying earlier, having someone who's direct experience, having those issues is really key. Our entire office, in my office, for example, are all immigrant refugee community members. We're the only Senate office that really have that kind of level of ensuring that our representation matters in our state. So my staff who are here today and all of us have that direct experience. And so for them to be at the table and having conversations about their own experience and their own challenges as community members also as well, highlights the importance of being at the table at the moment. So I think those are a couple of highlights that I want to make sure that we mention it, ensuring that we don't really, we are collectively build a vision for long term in this country, in the United States. How do we want to make sure that immigrant refugee rights movement is inclusive, is collective efforts, is all across the states? We are working together. That's why I really, really appreciate the work We Are All America also is doing in our national level. So ensuring that collaboration, this is about movement building. This is not about one state that doing great work or another state that's doing some additional work. It's all about creating long-term vision for our immigrant refugee rights and how do we build a strong movement to ensure that we are welcoming country overall.
Thank you, Senator Jama. Neera, I want to turn it to you now to answer the same question about your vision for 2022.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for us, as I mentioned earlier, we really looked into what are the needs of our newcomers. And what we identified here locally was housing, as Senator Jama mentioned earlier, for us as well is the biggest need. And I can personally speak on, from my experience of coming here as a former refugee, and it was not the most smooth process. And, once we resettled here, and unfortunately, it has been an issue for many years and continues to be, especially now that we're seeing our Afghan newcomers come into our local cities and resettle. And I think it's important that people really are welcomed with open arms, and that they deserve to be resettled with dignity into their new homes and not re-traumatized. And so one of the initiatives here and that we're taking on through the coalition and other partners, as we're launching a really exciting housing project where we submitted a $15 million proposal to the city of Phoenix for acquisition funding of a refugee transitional housing and a community center all in one place. And so what we started out was with a small housing working group within the coalition and with a small team. And we were able to really identify unique partners to bring to the table that we hadn't worked with in the past. And so we also identified several champions through the city council that would be supportive of this project. And really the goal is to alleviate some of the burden that we know the resettlement agencies face, and also alleviate the burden that the city is facing with the housing crisis, particularly here in Arizona. And also to provide arriving refugees the time and services that they need to integrate and resettle, and give them an opportunity to find permanent housing that they're really, happy with. And so we know all of the barriers. We did a lot of research to identify a lot of those barriers. And what this project would allow is it would provide an amazing, as I mentioned, community center where all of the resettlement agencies can come in one place and have an office. It would provide wraparound services of childcare and mental health support and workforce development all in one place. And this isn't intended to recreate what many resources and systems that are already in place within refugee resettlement. It's just another resource to alleviate some of the burden that many resettlement agencies and localities face. So currently we have very strong support from our city council, and we're also working with the county as well to see if we can work with them simultaneously to get county support as well and additional funding. And this would be done through ARPA funding. So for those of you out there, please go out there and advocate. You have this opportunity now through ARPA funding to get access for your communities. So I would really urge you to, get your advocates together. And as Britt was mentioning, it's important that you don't take this on all by yourself, that you have a strong team of folks that are willing to put a proposal for you, that are willing to meet with you weekly, that that way you're not, it's really not intended to be a one person job. It's really through community effort and grassroots organizing and a strong team. And so for us, this project was already introduced in the city council, and so far it was received very well. And we will need 5 city council votes in March to pass the project. And so I'm very optimistic that it will pass. I guess stay tuned for updates from us in Arizona.
Thank you. Sorry, Britt, did you want to?
I just want to say how exciting that is, and what a groundbreaking thing that could be, an example for other places. I just have to say that I want to quickly add that I think one of our challenges of ARPA funding is that legislators and others are wondering how these investments might be sustainable over time. And one of the sometimes legislators are hesitant, for example, to make investments, knowing if in 2 or 3 years they might not be able to, funding might not be able to continue. And I think the example of Arizona is so powerful in that sometimes it's helpful to go to elected officials and say, we need you to do this part of the lift local leaders are doing this part, the federal government's doing this part. We have a part to play that's crucial to have everything succeed. We're not asking you to do everything. We're asking you to do your part. And I think and coming to every level of government, that same approach often can move things forward. So I just really think it's great how you've set up this discussion with state and local, but also exciting things that happen in Arizona are really, really groundbreaking. It's exciting.
Thank you so much, Britt and Naira. I want to turn it now to questions from our audience in these last couple of minutes. The first question is an excellent question, especially in the context of American Rescue Plan funding, which prioritizes, underserved communities. The question is, are there any resources or strategies that can both support new immigrant and refugee population while also prioritizing historically marginalized communities, for example, Black, Latinx, and Native Americans in the U.S.? Senator Jama, let's start with.
Yeah, I think I would just quickly say that emphasize what I said earlier, which is really around, this is really a narrative we have to create, what kind of society that we want to live in, and that making sure that as immigrant refugee community members also, we organize and collaborate and work together with the indigenous and Black and brown community who are here been longer than us. So I think really I would encourage us to think about our movement as way of that, making sure that we're collaborating and we're not undermining the work of the other communities. So really partnership and building a strong alliance with those communities will be really a key element. That's the work that I have done for the last 20 plus years to ensuring that, when I'm talking about the immigrant refugee community members issues, I'm not talking about the expenses of the Black and brown community members. Where we're collaborative, we're uplifting all the issues that our community supports us. So that's kind of really one element that I want to make sure that encourage us immigrant refugee movement that we should reach out to, we should collaborate, we should create a space, we should talk about the challenges that the Black and brown community are facing in our community. So building that kind of a collaborative alliance will be really important and we should be able to guide us where we want to go as a society.
Naira and Britt, anything to add?
The only thing I would add to that is that one of the challenges we had here in Oregon is that we have historically had quite a small community of former Afghan refugees and Afghan recent arrivals. And so it was incumbent upon all of those who were tied together in relationship or who were in advocacy spaces to proactively reach out to as many community members as possible to help build the infrastructure, do our small part to help mentor and guide others to build organizations that over time can be really impactful in this space. So for those communities listening that are maybe receiving Afghan evacuees or Afghan community members for the first time or in any significant number, it's a real opportunity to be mentors of other groups who are looking to create culture-specific advocacy efforts. It's a really exciting time.
Naira?
Can you repeat the question, Balkis? I was answering some of the Q&A and missed the question.
No worries. The question was, how do you also work with communities that have been historically marginalized, such as Black, Latinx, and Native American communities in your efforts?
I would say it's important to have representation at the table. So bring folks from marginalized communities as part of these initiatives, as part of these projects. They need to be involved. They need to be engaged. We recently hosted a webinar to uplift what's going on at the southern border with Haitians and Cameroonians and other Black migrants, for example, and also LGBTQ community. So I think it's important to step outside of your comfort zone and your box and try to work with communities you may have not worked with before and different partners and make sure that they are represented in the different initiatives that you are working on.
We We have so many questions from our audience, and I'm hoping we can, I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them, but as a follow-up to that question, we had someone ask about asylees, and are they, forgotten in these efforts, or how are they incorporated?
I think that just quickly, that's kind of the work that, as I said earlier, we're trying to do in Oregon. And, one of the steps that my office is trying to do is that we created what we are calling Office of Immigrant Refugee Advancement. And we're now hiring the director of that office. And so the goal really is to create a vision for what the Oregon immigrant refugee movement should look like. And that's kind of the work that we're trying to do. And I think I agree with you. I think asylees issues should be included, all the efforts that we're trying to do. But our motto usually is that no one should be left behind. And that's really what we're trying to do in Oregon overall.
And I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, but we have two questions on specific, language access, healthcare coverage. Are there any efforts in your communities that incorporate language access as part of these initiatives, or expansion of healthcare coverage? Can you speak to that? And as well, to what extent are they inclusive of undocumented immigrants? Anyone wants to take that?
I think just quickly in Oregon, we just recently passed the Cover All People bill that includes ensuring that all Oregonians have health care access to regardless of their immigration status. We are right now currently also pushing $15 million for universal legal representation for all immigrant refugee community members who are facing deportation. There's so many efforts that's happening in Oregon that I can highlight, but those are a couple of the items that I can mention that we're really ensuring that we're inclusive. And the $18 million that we just passed for Afghan actually includes culturally specific food, as well as items, as well as the money for interpretation and language services. And particularly providing a training for Afghan community members who wants to become interpreters. So really, we try to do as holistic as much as we can.
Great. Britt, Nayra, anything to add, or should I move on to the next question? The next question is more specific to, refugees themselves. How does someone go about finding out how to identify refugee populations in a given state, as well as how do they identify what those needs are? Like, how much should each refugee family receive in terms of funding, and the questioner is asking just for a ballpark estimate of what a family needs to support themselves, and how to find the number of refugees in their community and how they go about doing that.
So a lot of this is public information, you can look up, and each state, most states have their refugee resettlement state programs, so you can look up information through them. Many of them host monthly, quarterly meetings where they bring all of refugee serving organizations together. Now with COVID, these types of meetings are usually done virtually, where they provide general information about the populations that are being resettled in your state, in your cities, in your counties, with the different resettlement agencies. Also, I would recommend, always connecting directly with the resettlement agencies or the ethnic community-based organizations, because they will know the needs. And usually they update it on their website, the specific needs. There's also other organizations, depending on what you're trying to get involved in. But like, for example, here we have an organization that does apartment furnishings that is always has examples on their website of the needs, current needs right now, as far as donations and things like that. So there's many different ways you can get involved, but I think the first step is connect with your local resettlement agencies.
Thank you so much, Nayra. As we are on the final minute of this webinar, I want to thank Senator Jama, Britt, and Nayra for joining us today and providing us with such invaluable insights To our audience, we hope this webinar and our report are helpful tools as you embark on your own advocacy. Here at the Refugee Advocacy Lab, we're more than happy to answer any questions. You can reach us at info@refugeeadvocacylab.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. There's going to be a recording of this available on our website. And for any other questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you again, all of us, for joining us.
You.
Thanks, everybody.